Hello, everybody. My name is Greg Asner. I'm the director of the Center for Global Discovery and Conservation Science at Arizona State University. I'm really glad to be able to deliver this talk remotely and in a recorded fashion, and I'm really sorry I can't be there. What I'm going to do today is, by way of an update for some, new science for many of you, I'm going to talk to you about some of our work in Peru, much of it with the Ministry of Environment over the years, but culminating in some breakthroughs that are rather recent in our ability to map forest carbon, not just stocks, but emissions at high temporal frequency. Going from the old days, just 3 years ago, of carbon stock mapping to carbon emissions mapping has not been easy, but because of the collaborations that we've developed and because of the technology advances just in the past 3 years, we've had some major breakthroughs. So I'm going to transition to some slides and turn off my video so that we can focus on what I'd like to show you today. This presentation is the culmination of years of effort to take us from the old days of mapping forest carbon with LiDARs and those types of technologies that emerged in the 80s, blossomed in the 90s, and have taken their course in the last 20 years in this century. We're still using LiDARs, airborne LiDAR, but we're not using them anymore for forest carbon stock or emissions mapping alone. And we now have the capability that, as I will show you today, of scaling from the airborne level of LiDARs up to the much larger areas using satellite data. This work is being done by my team as the lead, but with very close collaboration with the satellite company called Planet, formerly known as Planet Labs. And this particular work was funded by the Airborne Foundation. So this talk's title is Developing an Indicator of Forest Carbon Stocks and Emissions Using Satellites. This work that I'll show you today, in my view, as the lead of the program, is a pilot for going global. We want to, and we know how, to get to a point where we are mapping forest carbon stocks and emissions on a monthly basis for all of the green area you see here worldwide. That's the humid tropical biome. But today, we've mostly worked in Peru and also in Borneo, as you see highlighted on this map. I'm going to show you Peru today. Why do we do this? Well, I think those of you watching this video understand as well or better than I do that we're losing a large amount of tropical forest, including this past year. We've had quite a spike again in several countries. And Peru is one of the countries where tropical forest carbon emissions are increasing. It's not nearly as high as other countries like Brazil or parts of the Congo, but it's on the rise nonetheless. And so we want to understand where those carbon emissions are occurring, and especially from the point of view of Article 5 in the Conference of in the UN Convention, pardon me, focusing on the effort to conserve and enhance, as appropriate, sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, as referred to in Article 4. So, all of this is really underpinning work by UNDP and UNEP, FAO, and of course the host countries that are really driving this forward. The challenge in my part of the carbon stock and assessment world really focuses on MRV. It's an acronym meaning measurement, reporting, and verification. We have technological limits, and those generate some really big barriers to our ability to directly and frequently and with spatially explicit knowledge understand where our carbon stocks and emissions are changing. So we want to understand forest area, we want to understand how much carbon is in that forest area, and we want to monitor it over time. Peru is the focus for today's talk. For many years, I have used aircraft to map forest carbon stocks using technologies such as LiDAR This is my particular airborne laboratory that I fly today. We've had many iterations of this, and this airborne lab, or a predecessor of it, has been to Peru 3 times over the years to work with the Ministry of Environment to understand drivers of carbon stock changes in different landscapes of the Amazon and Andes. That's given rise to interesting results and fabulous outreach, such as shown here in this full cover, full spread in National Geographic way back in 2011. So by 2011, we were operationally mapping forest carbon stocks using lasers or LiDARs and converting that information as our partners needed it into knowledge about how much carbon was being stored and lost from certain parts of the Amazonian and Indian landscape. The essential measurement is one which takes us from looking straight down on forests and understanding where the forest is, which is the typical way that satellites are used, to understanding something about the vertical structure of a forest. Because as you look down, if you're not trained at understanding the different spectral properties of trees from above, you might confuse short trees from tall trees and you'll get the carbon totally wrong. One of the big challenges has been going up from the aircraft level to the satellite scale. And this is a neat panel because you get to see over the exact same area, or a contiguous area, I should say, of Peruvian Amazonian forest, the different technologies at work. To the far right is airborne LiDAR. And the reason this is useful is you see reds here, those are the tall trees, yellows are the shorter trees, and green, in this case, is a meander of a river or stream where there's very low vegetation. And the 3D nature of this image, where you can see into the page, tall things to short things, gives us that critical information that allows us to estimate carbon stocks. Well, there's been a lot of innovation from space. One of those innovations is high resolution satellite data, such as this planet's SkySat data, which allows us to see almost in 3D the positioning of the trees and the crown diameters and the roughness of the canopy. As you get more coarse towards the older and more traditional types of remote sensing data like Landsat, you lose the trees, so to speak. You still see the forest, but you've lost the trees. And so the challenge is in finding where in this satellite portfolio one can connect the patterns of tree cover and tree structure to those that can be more directly measured with LiDARs from the air. So over the years, we've flown quite a lot in both the Peruvian Amazon and Andes region. These small white lines are actually 1 to 2 kilometer wide areas. Here's a zoom of some of those areas. Flown all around Peru to sample the forest 3D structure with our airborne LiDAR, shown here in shorthand as the Global Airborne Observatory, or GAO. We've taken those data from the air and worked hard with machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other techniques to connect the airborne LiDAR shown here to different types of satellite data. This is a long slide that I won't dive into, but we have quite a range of documents, journal papers, and reports showing how we've tried to pattern match what we see from the airborne LiDAR to what we see from a range of satellite data sets. It's using artificial intelligence. The idea is if you can make these match well enough, you can replace the LiDAR with the satellite data and get an estimate of the above ground carbon stocks, or above ground carbon density, or ACD. And you can do that over time and understand gains and losses. Here's an example of what I'm talking about when it comes to satellite data and LiDAR data. The green are planet dove satellite imagery, and as it fades into the gray, that's our airborne laser data or LiDAR data. And you can see that there's a pattern that they share just with the naked eye. On the other hand, you can see that there's some pattern in the laser data, the gray image, that's lost in the green image or the satellite data. And so we've worked hard to figure out where those pitfalls are and how much of that match can be made. Jumping over many steps in order to keep the talk brief, we have succeeded in doing that, making the match between airborne laser data and satellite imagery. And most recently, we took the leap from using the traditional Landsat data to the more frequently available Planet Dove data. Why is this important? Planet Dove data allow us to see Peru up to every day of the week and weekend, every day. And so we're able to image not only at high frequency, but we can image so frequently that we can create cloud-free regions by collecting up the Dove data over, say, a period of a month. Whereas with Landsat data, which passes over every 16 days or less than twice a month, there are many regions that really you would miss on a monthly or even quarterly basis. The second innovation is that the Planet Dove data are 3.7 meter resolution. That's finer than 4 meter resolution, whereas the Landsat data are 30 meter resolution. So there's a big difference there, 100 times difference in area, 4 by 4 versus 30 by 30. So with that, we've been able to, with the Dove data, we've been able to scale up from the airborne laser data, doing the pattern recognition that I mentioned earlier, and create a forest carbon stock map shown here on the left, where reds are high carbon stocks and blues are very low. And you can see the naturally low above ground carbon stock of the leeward or dry side of the Andes in Peru. This is naturally low. But then over in the Amazonian side, for example, you can see blue areas where carbon stock is low due to deforestation near Puerto Maldonado or near Pucallpa in Ucayali, or even in areas that are naturally varying based on swampland dynamics and other natural processes, like in the Pacaya Samiria swamp, as you see here. Other areas are very high carbon stocks. Reds are extremely high all throughout. And even the pale reds I would call very high. Using those techniques with Planet satellite data trained with our airborne LiDAR, we're now routinely able to make an assessment for a country of any size, such as Peru. Peru in 2017, using 2017 satellite data, had about 7 billion metric tons of carbon in its above ground carbon stocks. This does not include below ground. Of that, when you overlay national parks and other types of protected areas, a little less than half of it is currently protected in Peru. So there's another nearly 4 billion tons of carbon in forests that are not officially protected. And this is looking at an area of about 129 million hectares of Peru. We can zoom in with data like this and see detail. Here's some examples. Here's an area, and this upper panel are the carbon stocks in a single year, 2017. And this is a look at them a couple of years later. And then we color-coded it so you could see the change. For example, here's intact forest with high carbon stocks in red, naturally low, such as in the river itself. Of course, that's 0 carbon stock. But even low around the areas that are naturally disturbed from the meanders and the floodplain activity of these rivers. And you see that here in the difference images between, say, the first imaging and the second imaging. You see the effect of these natural, call them carbon emission generators. Jumping over to the far right as an extremely different example, here are roads that are built. Here's a flat look at roads somewhere, I believe it would be in Madre de Dios. And here is some high carbon stock forests in red, and you see roads and cattle pastures and other agricultural fields as low carbon stock. But critically, if you look at, say, one time and then at another, you can see where the new carbon was emitted between 2 time steps from individual fields even, as I'm pointing to here on the screen. Here are some more examples. Here's a cacao plantation in northern Peru. I think it's in Loreto. Here's oil palm expansion on the Loreto-San Martin border. Here's gold mining in Madre de Dios. So there's, you know, it's easy once you get this right to take it down to the individual agent or land user type of scale at such fine resolution. Now, what happens when you go from once in a while looking at the forest from above to something that's more structured, annual versus quarterly, once every 3 months, versus monthly? What does that do to your carbon emission estimates? This is going to be the most important part of my talk. What we did was we looked at that in Peru in a series of quarters, and these are not in order because they're literally in temporal order. 2017, the third quarter, 2017, the fourth quarter, 18, the first quarter, and so forth. And then we looked in a nested way in each quarter and looked at a monthly, took a monthly view of what was happening with carbon. And you're going to see me use this term ACE, or above ground carbon emissions, or ACE. I came up with that acronym to describe the difference between looking at stocks or density and actual change, ACE, or above ground carbon emissions. This took nearly 600,000 satellite images, which were automatically analyzed by our artificial intelligence system, and nearly 300 trillion laser points from our airborne LiDAR to do the calibration and assessment of the accuracy of these satellite images, and of course some serious high performance computing, which is becoming everyday common in many places. Here's a look at Q3, above ground carbon density and the uncertainty. It's a nice thing is you get an uncertainty map for every hectare. And we already went over this geography. And if you look within a year, and this is a complicated figure, but it's worth taking an extra moment to look at, for each region of Peru, Cusco, Pasco, Amazonas, etc., you can look at how much of each of the quarters that we looked at, Q4 of 2017, Q1 of 2018, Q2 and Q3, so 4 quarters of a given year, you can see how much of the forest carbon that was emitted by successive views from satellite was taken up in that quarter. And what you can see, for example, is that Q4 was a big quarter for forest carbon emissions in Peru in general, especially in certain like Cusco, certain regions. You can also look by, say, national park or some other type of protection or management area. For example, Pacaya Samiria, it had carbon emissions averaging about 100 gigagrams that year overall, and that's a lot of that is natural because of the swamp dynamics of the region. But you can see it by quarter as well. You can break this number by quarter because you're imaging quarterly, which is something that's almost impossible to do with Landsat data due to cloud cover. You can also do it by annual versus quarterly for different buffer areas, for example, around national parks. And I'd like you to take a look at Cordillera Azul. You can see what the emissions number is overall for the year and its breakdown by quarter here. And then flash back to that area here and see that it's 38 inside the park compared to 1715 outside the park, gigagrams. So the park is functioning as it should. It's protecting its core, but the buffer area is getting a lot of carbon emissions, presumably from human activity, and it would be straightforward to look at that in the actual data. These are zooming in to see some of these effects. Here's a buffer zone next to this national park, and you can see lots of activity in terms of carbon emissions in the buffer zone, a little bit of intrusion into the park, but most of it is outside of the border. This is a repeating theme, the buffer zone, the Cordillera Azul, and then the actual buffer zone dynamics here, and so forth. And you get a really good tactical understanding every quarter of what's going on. One of the things we learned in doing this assessment is that by going to high resolution with Planet satellite data, just that alone, we increased the total estimated carbon emitted between 2017 and 2018. We had a higher number by 23.4% than FAO. And that's the effect of looking at the change spatially and at high resolution. You gather up more change that way. By going to a quarterly estimate, looking at each quarter of the year, this is critical take-home message. by going from annual to quarterly views of what's happening in Peru for these two example years of 2017 and 2018, we generated 83% higher carbon emissions than if we had only looked once a year. And the reason is, once a year, you get lightweight vegetation recovers the surface of the Earth, and it fools satellites. And so by looking at high temporal frequency, we get to see in between that regrowth and see the actual carbon emitted while it's still cleared or the tree has fallen, so to speak, before some small tree or some lightweight early pioneering successional tree fills that hole back in. So just by going to higher temporal frequency of quarterly, we got 83%. And then the final mind-blowing take home is that if you go to monthly, from quarterly to monthly, we add yet another 34% more carbon emitted or above ground carbon emissions than we had when we were just going every 3 months or quarterly. So by going high spatial resolution, we get more carbon emitted or collected up. By going higher temporal frequency, we get much more carbon collected up. That's what I wanted to say to you today. I hope this has been helpful. We're targeting our message to the science and policy communities. We're doing outreach on this. We're looking to expand this throughout the global humid tropics. There are some publications on this. It's probably easier to just send me an email if you'd like to hear about that or to read those articles. And I want to thank my core collaborators and staff for working on this particular project. I can be reached most easily at gregasner@asu.edu. So that's my talk today. I hope that it's been informative, and I'm sorry I can't be there. I hope that you can generate some great questions, and if anything technical needs to come my way, please feel free to send it. Thank you so much, and have a great workshop.